Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name's Dr. Tom Alves. I'm Head of Development here at AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this next instalment in our AHURI webinar series. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the several lands from which I'm sure many of you are joining us as well. I pay my respects to elders, past and present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge and pay my respects to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for the webinar today. We always like to pay our respects to elders and to acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples around the country and their ongoing cultures and continuing connections to lands and waterways throughout Australia. Before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I need to provide you with a few simple instructions about how to use the webinar platform that we're using today. Firstly, I also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded. So if you do need to leave at any time, or if you want to return later to the webinar, you'll be able to do so. We'll make the recording of the webinar available through the AHURI website in coming days. Later today, you will also receive a survey via an email, which will be seeking feedback from you about the webinar. This helps us to continue to refine and improve our future webinars and to make sure that we're presenting information that's of interest to you. So please do submit that short survey when you receive it. To participate in today's webinar, you have the opportunity to submit questions via the Q&A function, which I'm not quite sure which way I'm pointing, but in the top right-hand part of your screen, you should see a Q&A function. And that's where I invite you to submit questions at any time during the webinar or presentation. I'll be collating those questions and we'll be asking them to our panel. So please keep them coming throughout the session. We've also opened up the chat function in the software as well. If you'd like to share your thoughts with other participants, that's in the same section. You'll see the chat next to the Q&A. And you can put chat in at any time during the webinar. And just to get things started, you may want to let us know what lands you're joining us from today. However, please make sure when submitting a question that you put this into the Q&A part of the function, because that's where I'll be looking to gather up the questions to ask to our presenters today. Look, I'm delighted to facilitate today's webinar, which we're hosting together with Melbourne City Mission. And the topic of the webinar today is towards a youth homelessness strategy for Victoria. This webinar will present some initial findings from research that AHURI's professional services team is conducting in partnership with Melbourne City Mission. A report based on this work will be published soon, and we'll make this available for download on the AHURI website. And we'll send out an email to everyone who's registered for this webinar to let you know when the report has been launched. Over the years, AHURI has published quite a lot of research by our university partners investigating youth homelessness, its causes, its costs, and ways to address it. And indeed, our very first webinar in 2020, back at the start of the pandemic, was a presentation by David McKenzie looking at the redesign of the homeless services system for young people. Well, today, we're looking at youth homelessness once again, and our focus is very much on Victoria today. And in particular, we're looking at the strategic policy context around youth homelessness and the youth homelessness system and how it operates in Victoria. I'd now like to introduce you to our panellists for today's discussion that you can see on the screen. Firstly, Wayne Merritt. Wayne is the General Manager of Homelessness and Family Services at Melbourne City Mission. Wayne is a leading sector voice, particularly on the homelessness experience of young people. He is a member of the Victorian Government's Ministerial Homelessness Advisory Committee, and he is on the board of the Council to Homeless Persons. which leads me, of course, to Kate Colvin. Kate is Manager Policy and Communications and Deputy CEO at the Council to Homeless Persons, which of course is Victoria's peak body for the homelessness sector, and a voice advocating for the homeless. Kate is the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home campaign, and she leads the policy and strategic communications at the Council to Homeless Persons. With over 20 years experience in policy and advocacy roles, Kate has led successful campaigns on numerous issues, including housing affordability, youth justice, and accessible transport. Kate is passionate about addressing youth homelessness, and she was also formerly the CEO of Youth Affairs Council for Victoria. And last but not least is my colleague, Dr. Nicola Bracketts, who is Senior Manager of Professional Services at AHURI. Nicola is a research specialist, and she has over 15 years experience in a wide range of fields of research related to public policy, social justice, housing, and disadvantage. Nicola is one of the researchers working on this project, and she has also led the evaluation and review of numerous homelessness and youth homelessness programs in several states. The format of today's webinar will include a short presentation overview of the project by Wayne Merritt from Melbourne City Mission. And after that, I will facilitate discussion with our participants, which will include, of course, questions that you provide. So please, once again, I remind you, think about questions you may want to ask and put those into the Q&A section of the software on your screen. Anyway, it's now my pleasure to hand over to Wayne. Wayne, thank you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everybody. Before I start, I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we're all meeting and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to thank all the Aboriginal people of our community for sharing their lands, their waterway, and their rich culture with us. So I'm very excited about this piece of work that I'm about to speak about. It's been a long time coming. So to start off with, I'd just like to give a quick overview of Melbourne City Mission and our role that we play within the youth homelessness space. So Melbourne City Mission is Melbourne's oldest charity, and we've been working alongside people who are disadvantaged and their communities for about 165 years now. We're the state's largest provider of youth homelessness programs. We operate a whole range of youth refuges and youth foyers, but we also operate the state's only youth access point, Front Yard, which is the main entry point for young people into the homeless system. We also have a whole range of early intervention and longer-term case management programs that spread the spectrum of supports for young people experiencing homelessness. And each and every day we hear from our staff, the sector, and most importantly the young people we work alongside, of the need for change, the need for innovation, and the need for something else. So given the broad spectrum of services and programs we offer, we see more and more young people spending longer time in the system bounced between different homelessness services, spending several years cycling between refuges, friends' houses and rooming houses, and the intersecting service systems that we all work within. Representations at Front Yard has been on the increase, and unfortunately more of these young people are transitioning into adult homelessness and into longer-term chronic homelessness. Alongside this is many great programs for young people that we all work within, but for a long time now it's felt that they are working in silos and at different parts of the system, whether it be early intervention, crisis and transition points, or housing supports, and not speaking to each other in a client-centred or strategic way. I think moving forward, it's critical for our functioning system, including homelessness systems, to have an overarching framework and strategy that all of the parts operate from under. There's also been a growing feeling in the sector and broader youth services that young people have been dealt with as add-ons to the service system, and that they're now falling under a system designed for adults, without the specific developmental needs of young people being addressed. Last year, CHP released a great report covering off some of these points as well. We also know that young people experience a number of key life transitions, including moving from being a young person to adulthood, from study to work, and from living with family to independent living in the community. It's important to recognise that their needs extend beyond a roof over their head. The young people that we all support are still in the process of learning who they are, how they fit into the world, and are, as all of us are, and have been reliant on support to do this, both emotionally and financially. It's so important, and I'm sure you all agree, that we try and prevent young people from becoming homeless in the first place. But we also need a system that functions efficiently and supports the young people who do fall into homelessness to exit as quickly as possible and permanently out of the system. This way we stop acting as a revolving door for so many of these young people. Excitingly, with the development of the 10-year housing strategy, youth strategy, and the parliamentary inquiry, we saw an opportunity to rethink and reshape how we can tackle youth homelessness in Victoria, and in particular, the need for a standalone strategy that responds to the individual and developmental needs of young people at risk of experiencing homelessness. But before I step into some of the key findings, I'd just quickly like to say a quick thank you to Tom, Nicola, and the AHURI team for their research and for partnering with us on this critical piece of work that we've needed to do. So, a couple of key findings that have come out of the work so far from AHURI. The first point I'd like to cover off is that there is a missing current strategic focus on youth homelessness. Most recent Victorian youth homelessness strategy dates back to 2004. Instead of developing a newer, dedicated youth homelessness strategy, overarching housing and homelessness policies and strategies are now the main framework that shape current service responses for young people. Yet the experience and situation of homelessness for young people differ considerably to that of older cohorts. Some of the forms of homelessness that are more common for young people, such as couch surfing or living in overcrowded dwellings, have not been effectively addressed through policy and strategies in Victoria. The research has found that beyond articulating direction for change, there is a lack of funding commitments and specified outcomes and targets these strategies seek to achieve. This has also led to programs and parts of the youth homelessness system working in silos. Access points, refuges, transitional housing and foyers are not streamlined, and there are no clear pathways out of the system once a young person is in crisis and reaches the access point. An issue with program-based approaches is that they can become siloed and disconnected from each other. Sometimes, as I've mentioned earlier, young people can cycle between multiple service providers and intersecting systems for years. It's important to point out that there is a huge gap in research and strategic review of these pieces of the system. Most research that we get focuses on early intervention and the housing response. This is further exacerbated by a lack of strategic coordination and integrated approaches across the broader service sectors. Missing integration of services is particularly problematic for young people at transition points, such as escaping family violence, leaving school, or engagement with mental health or justice systems. Overarching homelessness and housing strategies mostly address the needs of young people with an early intervention prevention context, which is critical, but the strategies lack a youth-specific focus for the majority of the system once a young person is in crisis. And this is one of the most important pieces that I'm very passionate about. There's also a need to embrace trauma-informed and client-centered principles. There's now, as we all know, increased societal awareness of the issues of trauma and mental health on young people compared to when the youth homelessness system was originally designed. There's a need to update the homelessness system to adopt these principles in service design and practice. For example, transactional short-term crisis responses or high caseloads, office-based brokerage and referral services are to be avoided, and duration of intervention should be needs-based and individually negotiated. As I wrap up, I've got a couple of key points which are standout pieces for myself. So the firstly is, as the Victorian Government develops its 10-year housing strategy and a substantial review of homelessness policy in the state nears completion, we have a great opportunity to rethink how young people fit into this emerging policy landscape. Secondly, a new youth homelessness strategy in Victoria that is based on developmental approaches offers the opportunity to have a more efficient youth homelessness system in Victoria, which programs and services are streamlined and service delivery can draw on up-to-date best practice approaches. And to finish off, as I'm sure everybody would agree, its planning and strategy needs to consider the whole system, not just individual parts, and that the development of any youth-specific strategy needs to involve young people with lived experience of homelessness at the centre of all of that. So thanks, Tom.
Great, thanks,
that's
Wayne.
Me.
I appreciate that nice quick overview of, I guess, what's inspired the work that we're doing, and also, I guess, some of the initial key things that we're looking at there. Look, let's unpack that a bit now among ourselves, and I guess might just ask Nicola first, just sort of thinking about young people. What is it that young people need to thrive, and young people experiencing homelessness? What are those broad types of support that young people experiencing homelessness need?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a great question. And Wayne, you've already outlined some of the things that are important for young people. I guess the key things to keep in mind is that young people are at a particular stage in their life, but they're still really developing their skills on, their life skills generally, how to rent a house, how to pay an electricity bill, how to tidy up after yourself, how to shop, how to cook, how to go to a real estate agent, what the responsibility is for maintaining a house for, if you manage to get a tenancy, to keep that tenancy. So the kind of responses that young people need are really, really different. But I think keeping that in mind also, that really means that the responses need to be tailored, not just to provide young people with particular kinds of services, but also with the kind of supports that they need to actually make the best of those services. So, for example, not just providing, housing, but also providing support to maintain that housing and to, be able to look after that housing. So that's one really important thing. And I guess within all of that, when we think about a young person, I guess the really important thing would be to think of the young person as a person, as a whole, in a holistic kind of way. What does a young person need to thrive? They need to feel that, I guess, a sense of normalcy, that they are able to do the kind of things that their peers do. Peers are very important for young people, that they have the opportunity to develop their skills, that they have continuity, that they can build relationships with peers, with workers, with other adults that might be role models for them. So I guess the really key thing would be to take a holistic approach to the young person. I guess that's sometimes described in policy as a person-centered approach. I find that's slightly sort of a hands-off way of thinking at it. It's sort of a kind of maybe a social work perspective on it. But really, it's really important for policies to consider all the needs of a young person to enable them to thrive, so they don't think of themselves as a problem or a person with a deficit, but as a young person who is learning, who is growing, and whose strengths can be developed through the kind of support that they receive. And I think what we do see, and Wayne has also referred to that, is that in actual fact, that is not often the case. I think that the kind of support that young people often receive can be either very deficit-centered or, what is definitely always the case, it's very fragmented. So there's someone helping a little bit with housing, and then there's someone helping a little bit maybe with education, and then there's someone trying to help with a different aspect of the young person's life. So it's not particularly integrated, and it's definitely not a sort of normalizing experience for the young person, I think. And I guess the other key thing really would be for young people, because in terms of developing their skills, I mean, the idea is to assist young people to develop their skills to become independent and not to enter into a system that provides supports, but rather than helping them grow as a person, means in a way that they become stuck in the system because the various services and supports don't connect. And so young people can end up bouncing around the system rather than growing and being able to exit.
Thanks, Nicola. Kate, can I ask you, what are the, I guess, the key elements of the homelessness system for young people? And I mean, obviously, we want to intervene early, and ideally, we wouldn't have young people becoming homeless. But for young people who are homeless, what are the key components of the homelessness system?
Thanks, Tom. I think one of the challenges that we face is that in many ways there's sort of not a system around the state. And so the responses that young people get really depend on where they live, because there'll be some elements of a service system in many locations, but not all. And then there might be some really fantastic boutique services that provide a great response, but they might just be like in one LGA. But that said, there are some sort of main parts that are in many places. So that's sort of coming in through an access point. So either people can call front yard or come into front yard if they're in Melbourne, or go into a mainstream access point and get assessed about what their needs are. And then the question is, well, what happens then? So often young people will then go into refuge if they have a need for accommodation immediately, if there's a refuge in their area, and if the refuges in their area have a place. So the idea of refuge is, is that young people sort of go in for a short period of time to get the issues that they have resolved, and then either are able to return home or to go into long-term accommodation. So I just want to flag the issue with that in the current system for young people who do go into refuge, but also then flag that actually a lot of people don't go into refuge, and there are some issues with that. So I think the idea that the young people have like a short-term problem that can be quickly resolved in a 6-week refuge stay is something that was perhaps, when the service system was designed, was the thinking, but I think is something that needs a refresh, because young people who are not able to any longer safely live at home would tend to have longer term issues that they need support with that can be quickly resolved in a 6-week stay. So one of the things that we've been sort of talking about is young people needing longer term support and not just that sort of short intervention. But the other thing is the idea is young people go from refuge and then into long-term housing, but in actual fact, young people can't afford housing in the private rental market. And so we end up with this system where there's this sort of blockage. So a young person might go into refuge and then go and need to go to another refuge, which is, quite dislocating. And Wayne was talking about sort of trauma-informed responses, which would suggest that we have consistency of workers and not, in fact, be moving young people from refuge to refuge. But perhaps the bigger problem, even though there are problems with how refuge works, is that young people who can't get into a refuge place, either because they're full or there's not one nearby, might go into emergency accommodation in a hotel or a rooming house. Right. And that is a situation that's quite worrying, because they'll be in that hotel quite likely without support and quite likely sharing that space with adults who've also come through the homelessness service system, who might have a whole set of issues that are perhaps not, mean that they might not be the sort of safest or best company for a young person who's pretty traumatized. And so having kind of safe accommodation for young people at that first point is sort of one of the issues that I think, a strategic framework for homelessness would address. But the other, there's so many issues, but the other sort of big one that I'll flag just now is just the question of what kind of longer term housing is most suitable for young people if they can't return to a family environment. And that's another issue in the service system, is that there's bits and pieces of supported housing, whether it's FOIA or other like youth transitional housing, but they're not, they look quite hard to get into. There's not enough places, but also particularly with youth transitional housing, it's intended as quite a short-term intervention just for a few months. But young people, if they can't afford private rental accommodation, and if they have a whole set of needs for support, need a longer term supported housing option, which is really, there's very few pockets where there's access to that kind of longer term supported housing. So that's one of the really big gaps in the service system. And then as we go through the conversation, I'll probably just say more too about connections to education and family as well, but I should stop talking.
That's okay.
I think, Tom, can I just add?
Yeah, sorry, Wayne.
Sorry, can I just add to Kate's piece as well? I think the other highlight is if we're operating a trauma-informed kind of model of care, then we need to acknowledge that the length of time to address trauma in young people who have been disconnected from their family, their friends, their community, in out-of-home care, bouncing between whatever support services they had for their life, we need to realise that also takes a long period of time to address in a way successfully, so that young person can then move forward with their life in a way that they choose. And so, 2 years worth of housing, sometimes it takes 2 years to actually actively engage with a young person to build up rapport and connection, so they can actually start addressing some of those past traumas. And if we're looking at a trauma-informed care model and we're putting the client at the centre, then we need to ensure that we've got the right support model wrapped around that young person so they can succeed and that they're not bouncing in between our kind of current responses to suit the needs of what we currently have in a system. And our current system, yes, there's some great things that work within there. So we're not saying that it's bad. We're saying that there's some pieces that we need to tweak and alter, but also we need to have a client-centred approach. And what does that look like moving forward for young people at the centre of that piece there?
Yeah, can I just add to that? And I think that's a really important point as well, is that, you know, what you said about trauma-informed approaches. I think that the sad thing is at the moment with the way it's operating with young people sort of bouncing between different kind of services or support, that can actually make their trauma worse or re-traumatize them. Sort of this experience of the support dropping off, them finding themselves in a worse situation again before they, you know, enter into a different kind of service. So the system is actually causing trauma on top of trauma rather than, you know, taking this trauma-informed approach.
Yeah, and rightfully or wrongfully, homelessness is the catch-all for everything. And with that comes a whole range of other additional kind of pieces that young people bring with them that we as a sector are trying to work through as well. And so, you know, it's multiple overlays of things that young people are presenting with as well that fall, you know, outside of a kind of traditional homelessness type response. So, yeah.
Sure. Well, we're starting to get some questions coming in from our listeners, and so I'd like to begin asking those. Wayne, I might ask the first one to you. Philippa asks, will the social housing review that's currently being done be able to inform a youth homelessness strategy for Victoria?
I think Kate, jump in as well with this one. I think it will help with that. I think the focus on young people specifically needs to be brought out as a piece of work itself to ensure that that kind of social housing policy piece covers off that. But the thing around that for young people, as Kate, I think it was Kate who mentioned, is the financial status of young people makes it really difficult for them to succeed in the current kind of systems, how they're sitting. You know, they can't afford to pay, 25% of someone's income for rent and those sorts of pieces leaves a young person $20-something a day to live on. So, we've got a system set up to keep young people entrenched in poverty because we've got a certain funding way of doing a piece of work. So hopefully coming out of all these pieces of work that we do, there can be a review and a refocus on some of those kind of financial contributions that are needed for young people.
Can I just jump in there, because I think there's some questions around social housing and young people which are really interesting and are sort of point to why we need a youth homelessness strategy and not just a general homelessness strategy. So for adults, we would always say people need long-term permanent housing, but actually young people are going through all of these transitions, and I think there'd be very few of us who would say that the place that we chose to live in when we were 17 was the same place that we still wanted to be in when we were 30. So in actual fact, like for young people, something medium term is probably a really good option, because we also, really want to encourage young people to really invest in their education and to really be working on what kind of employment might they want to be in, and testing themselves out and experimenting with different jobs potentially in the employment market, which might then at some point mean they want to move somewhere different. But youth housing models that can provide that medium term option are currently not really a feature of the social housing system. But if we were really designing a housing model for young people, then it might look a bit different and not necessarily be long term, not necessarily have the same rent setting model. There's a model in New South Wales which I think is quite interesting, which it starts off, young people pay a certain proportion of or pay a rent, and then over time that rent increases because it's about a pathway into private rental housing, and it's about encouraging them to be engaged in employment. So as their employment income increases, they're also paying more rent, and then at the end of it, they're sort of ready to move into private rental. So I think that one of the things we've called for in the social housing review is actually for there to be more space to create youth-specific housing models.
Thanks, Kate. That's great to, I guess, talk about social housing there. And interestingly, then our next question talks about the private sector and what they can do. So Simon's asking, what role do you think that the private sector can play in contributing and advocating for housing for young people? For example, can the construction industry or some other part of the property industry play a role? Is there a role for them?
Me?
Does anyone want to grab that? Anyone?
Go for it, Kate.
Look, I think in terms of the sort of philanthropic contribution of the construction industry, and that there's always a role for that. But in terms of a whole system solution, I think that what we're really talking about, so that it's not just something that's boutique and offered just here and not there, is something that's led by government. But, I do often see, government might give a grant for the construction of a certain type of dwelling, like whether it's foyer or housing, and, agencies who take on that building opportunity, if they can partner with architects and builders who, have a real passion for it and can reduce the cost of that construction, that's, a really fantastic partnership. And look, if it also then includes young people as apprentices in the construction activity, then that sort of further adds to the value of that intervention. But I think it's not that the whole solution is going to lie with those kinds of philanthropic commitments.
I think it's a whole community response, and it's a whole kind of sector response, and philanthropy plays a major role in helping with innovation and new programs and those sorts of pieces. Each of the major projects we've done over the past few years, our front yard, our new youth refuge in Werribee, those sorts of pieces have had a proportion of funding from government, but then a large chunk of money has come from philanthropy to support that piece of work happening. And, I think it's a dual process. I think it's corporates, it's philanthropy, and it's government all coming together to go, as a community, we can make change here and we can have a different response here and not be all reliant on government. There needs to be a commitment from government and a commitment from other people to help kind of find that leverage piece in the middle. But I do think there is a key role for philanthropy and for corporates to support these pieces of work. The PIF, a whole range of different organisations help out with these pieces and play key roles. But it's a bigger piece of work that's needed. Everyone plays a piece, but it's a much larger strategy needed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think it'd be dangerous, though, to reduce the homelessness strategy just having to be a housing response. I think housing is an absolutely critical element, because without adequate housing, it wouldn't work. But it's only one component of the greater strategy that we need.
Great.
Great. All right. Look, Kate, another Kate, is asking a question here, saying, look, given that we understand that there are silos and that there are disconnections that exist in the services system, how can we, she asks, how can we direct funding to address these issues? Or, I guess more broadly, how can we address these issues of silos within the system? Nicola, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I can give it a go. The problem with silos is that the gaps between the silos are the really difficult points where young people are at greatest risk. And some of the many of the programs that are currently operating, they actually have elements, or let's say on paper, there are often strategies that are designed to assist young people to transition those gaps. For example, having transition planning between moving from out-of-home care into housing and so forth. But what we know is that in actuality, these kind of sort of transitions or these plans don't work, or that young people don't experience their transitions through the system in the same way, I suppose, as it is specified within policy. So I guess a lot of the things that are barriers for young people are the sort of kind of eligibility criteria between the different kind of silos, are the kind of, that could be, in terms of age, or in terms of the kind of housing status that a young person is classified as, or, in terms of what particular services they are currently accessing, where they are. And we also know that, like, on the ground, I think often there are good collaborations between services that allow young people to, work effectively and transition between different kinds of services. But I think the important thing in terms of sort of bridging the silos at a higher level would be having policies that actually explicitly address the fact that there are silos, and that are also backed up by plans and mechanisms that would actually enable us to bridge, or enable these gaps to be bridged, whether that is through high level memoranda of understanding, or other sort of like formalized kind of collaborations. And I guess key to that would be sort of having an overarching policy, rather than having a particular policy for justice, a particular policy for out-of-home care, a particular policy for homelessness. Each of these policies sort of mentioning, oh yeah, it's very important that we also work with, say for example, homelessness policy saying it's very important that we work with justice, actually having that backed up by some plans and by an overarching framework that shows how these bridges can be built and how that can work.
Yeah. And I think within that as well, having, kind of key pieces of, linked data. So each of these different streams have data and access to data, but how do we link data together so that follows a young person that we're working with, so it's a shared, consistent response to the work we're doing over time, as opposed to segmented pieces of work. And, we've got SHIP, we've got all these kind of databases that we use. There has to be, and there is a way of linking them together so that the story of a young person goes with them, and it's a shared case plan that's outcome focused towards the end of it. So it's not just a kind of bed night piece or a target to tick off, but it's actually a real outcome focus for that young person. How do we have that across the sector?
Yeah, and I think that's where one of the big research gaps is that we still have. I think we sort of understand how it's envisaged that young people access the system, but we know anecdotally that that's not how it actually happens. And what you said, Wayne, this ability to use the linked data to actually track how young people really experience their trajectories through the system is really, really important. And we just don't know enough yet, not because we can't do it, but because we haven't actually done it yet.
Yeah.
Can I just, so I sometimes, maybe a slightly different perspective, that I sometimes think we really overstate the degree to which the silos are a problem within homeless services, because, within each area, the services are networked together, and far more of a problem is that there's just not enough to go around. So no amount of connecting the refuge to the available youth transitional housing places will make more youth transitional housing places available.
Yeah, sure.
And, if there's already 5 young people for every place, then having more networks so that we've got 10 people for every one place is just more people missing out, not actually better outcomes.
Yeah.
But one of the areas where I think, we have these really massive disconnections between where service access is based on demand and where service access is just rationed, like it is in homelessness services, is if you compare the justice system to the homelessness service system. So we've got a whopping great brand new, youth justice detention facility being constructed, which is perhaps the most damaging form of accommodation for young people. And yet when young people leave the youth justice system, they come to a homelessness service system very commonly that has no accommodation able to be provided for them. And so they might go, and couch surf with some acquaintances that they might have made in their justice journey. And lo and behold, they're back involved in, activity that brings them back into the justice system. So I think, I guess I just want to sort of say a plug for no amount of reorganising the limited funds that are available within homelessness will, address the massive service gaps that there are for young people. But perhaps if, we were to use some of the resources that go into the justice system to damage young people and use them to actually, support them to thrive, then we might get better outcomes.
And I think that's where some of that kind of linked data comes in as well, kind of what young people are going to justice and homelessness and mental health, and what's the crossover, and what can we be doing differently,
Thanks, Kate. Your comments were a nice segue actually to Keith's question. And Keith points out, there's obviously the lack of accommodation that you've mentioned. and that this leads, as I think you've indicated, to a bit of a crisis-oriented sector. His question is, how do we move the dial on this? How do we sort of get out of a crisis-oriented focus to something different?
I think having a strategy is a really important part of that, and a strategy that's not just about the homelessness service system, but it's about the systems that feed into the homelessness service system. So I already mentioned, justice. If we had proper exit planning and resources to support young people who are being exited from the justice system, then less of them, would necessarily need to come to homeless services to get their needs met. But likewise, sort of even further sort of back down the track, if we had better family support rather than just, I think the reality now for families who are struggling with issues around the health of adults or substance misuse among adults, mental health issues, not getting the support that they need, and that oftentimes results in young people, feeling like they need to leave and ending up homeless. So if we had a system that sort of looked at, well, where are young people coming from into the homelessness service system, and how can we reduce those pathways in, how can we better support young people, better support families so young people are safe within families. And I think, Keith's been involved in some really fantastic work in schools where we sort of better identify young people who are at risk of homelessness and provide the supports to them before they become homeless. So, whether it's they need more support to negotiate conflict in their family environment, or whether or not they need support to find perhaps a safer, some safer adults to live with, and support to sort of make that transition to be in a different environment. There's all sorts of supports that young people might need to not become homeless, but I think shifting the dial is really about looking at that, what happens before young people come to homelessness and what can we do so that they don't end up with us, is really how we move that dial.
It's kind of like a parallel process of looking at, the crisis we're in now and dealing with all of those pieces, but then the strategy, then what's our longer term plan? How do we stop looking at the crisis pieces and have a really clear longer term plan that covers off early intervention, but also those crisis points where young people have connection with our homelessness service systems and what we need to do differently in terms of responding to those young people. The early intervention response, fantastic, getting to schools, getting with young people, work with families, provide opportunities to keep young people at home if it's safe to do so, bungalows in backyard through kindergarten, the whole range of different programs and services that can help in that space there. But it's also about then what are those other transition points, because we know we're always going to have young people entering into the crisis services at different points, and how do we keep those resourced but have a really streamlined approach to ensure they get out of homelessness as quick as possible.
I think it's also about the duration of the support that is provided and why it's provided for a different for certain amounts of time. So I guess one of the key things would be to provide that young person with support until the young person doesn't actually need the support anymore, rather until the funding envelope or the time limit set by the particular service has run out. So I think that would be one really key shift in emphasis, to provide the support until the young person doesn't need support.
I think there's been some kind of recent good learnings about, or whichever way people see this piece, but the Homelessness to Homes program is kind of like targeted, tailored, and intensive type of support package for people over a period of time in their homes. And, that's fantastic because, the allocated hours per person for a length of time and what the outcomes need to be for that individual. And so everyone's clear about what they're doing and the pieces of work. And I think some really good learnings in that space there that we can use moving forward for that kind of tailored, targeted, funded package per piece per individual. There's out-of-home care packages. So there's some work that's happened around individual packages for people that we could learn from and use for young people that enter into our spaces.
That's good. And I think we've started to touch on Leanna, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, sorry if I'm not, was asking around how long is sufficient for, particularly a transitional housing program. And Leanna says she manages a program where it's it's only for up to 12 months. And I think Nicola, you were just saying before, how some of a proper trauma-informed perspective would need to, I guess, look at what does a young person need. I mean, Kate, did you have any further comment to add to answer what Leanna's asking there?
Look, just to really agree with Nicola that I think that longer term case management is really important, but also just to be able to be flexible. So some young people might just need a short intervention to get settled in a new, place to live, but others are going to really need something much longer term. And I think the other sort of point about a youth homelessness strategy is that our goals for young people should be bigger than just that they're housed. So I think, young people, we should have goals that are around their being able to achieve their goals around education and employment, but also, and I saw in the chat also, there's really important goals to achieve for young people around their connection with people who are important to them in their community. And that can mean their family of origin, but it can also mean other adults and connections in the community that are can be part of their identity and part of their well-being and ability to kind of move forward and live a really great life, because none of us are an island, and I think it's part of the human experience to be connected. But young people are forming those connections at a really transitional time in their life, and particularly if they're experiencing homelessness. So I think that's should be part of the role of the youth homelessness service system, is to support young people to form and sustain really sustaining connections in their community.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest. I was just going to say, that's one of the biggest success factors we see with our young people is if they're connected to community that's safe and they're well, then everything else is possible. But if they're kept in that world of turmoil and no connections and no kind of safe space to link to, then they're constantly in a world of revolving kind of chaos at times. And so it's our role to help them settle and connect with what they feel comfortable and safe connecting to. So,
I was going to say, Sarah's asking if there's a role for sort of mentoring programs within the youth homelessness system.
I think absolutely. In relation to forming those connections we've just talked about, but also in terms of giving young people perspectives on what's possible to do with their lives, so they don't have to have a limited perspective of how their life could turn out, to help them achieve whatever aspirations they have, or perhaps broaden the range of the aspirations that they do develop, because they can have a mentor who might help them to explore areas they hadn't thought of doing. Like I remember I was working with a youth homelessness program in Brisbane some years ago, and a young girl really wanted to be a car mechanic. And she thought that was unachievable, but over a period of time of working within that program and having people assist her to get the base skills she needed to get that mechanic's apprenticeship, she actually managed to enter into that apprenticeship, and that was for her something that she had not actually thought was possible. So I think it's just mentoring is really important as well, just to help people get new perspectives on what they can do with their lives.
And it also provides a different way of seeing things, besides having a worker work alongside you with things. A bit more of a casual conversation, a bit more of a lived life experience of what they've gone through. Those sorts of pieces is good. It's kind of like that peer worker, that kind of lived experience worker. They provide other opportunities, other ways of seeing things. And I think, that's part of that system response. What do we need to connect young people, and what do they need to be able to, work through things? It's mentors, it's people with lived experience, it's professionals, it's mental health clinicians, it's a whole range of people, and it's a multidisciplinary team that makes up that support package for that young person.
Thanks. Well, we're getting near the end of our discussion. I haven't quite asked every question, but we're getting close. But there are a couple of questions that do touch on this issue of I guess, early intervention and prevention. And I'm just wondering, maybe, you have touched on it, I know already, but can we just quickly sort of say, is this something that needs a bit more focus in the system, or is this something that the system is addressing adequately at the moment? And, you know, just, I guess, that balance between a focus on early intervention versus a focus on, you know, on, I guess, the, you know, people who are in crisis or in more immediate need. Wayne, do you want to kick off first with that one, or do you want to?
Yeah. No, I think
Sure.
no. Like, it's an interesting question. We know if we intervene early in a young person's life and whatever's going on in their family, then we can stop them entering into homelessness. So absolutely, there needs to be more investment in early intervention in schools, in first to know services, education with GPs, education with whoever is the first to know. Absolutely. So 100% need more investment in there. I think we need a wider view on early intervention and prevention and what it looks like, and how place-based responses can be done for young people in this early intervention space. But what are the intersecting service systems need to support them to do this and do this well? You know, school settings, what do they need to succeed and be able to intervene early in a young person's life? Is it a welfare coordinator, or is it a team of people that work alongside young people who have been identified as potentially having some kind of concerns at home, or whatever it might be? So I think absolutely needs more investment.
And Kate, any thoughts from you?
Look, I think one of the things that we haven't sort of touched on, which is in the early intervention, or maybe it would sort of more the rapid response space, is how we support young people to sort of not come into the homeless service system to get a response, but then to be quickly responded to. Okay. Because sometimes one of the biggest risk factors for young people can be connecting too much with other young people who are homeless. So, you know, and that can be a challenge in a refuge environment if you've got young people just thinking about issues around substance misuse, for example. If you mix young people who have become involved in a substance misuse kind of subculture with young people who haven't had that experience, you can have, you know, cross-fertilization of those issues, which is not helpful to young people who, until that moment, have not, you know, sort of really got into experimenting with drugs. So if young people, and, you know, we've got pretty limited capacity in the homelessness service system to do this, but ideally, if young people come in and then can just be not go into refuge, but quickly responded to by finding other family members perhaps that they could live with if their current living arrangements not sustainable, or getting them into longer term housing and support options, then then we don't have that issue. And I think one of the challenges is that at the moment we only have you know, refuge is the sort of most common response, because it's the response that we have, and that can just present those problems.
Yeah, I think that, you know, refuges are huge. In terms of numbers coming through that all of the access points are seeing, refuge has no capacity to cover up all the needs of those young people. Majority go into hotels, rooming houses, back home with friends, family, couch surfing, whatever. But I do think there is the early intervention focus and the focus on this piece here, but we've also spoke about the longer term needs of young people and the longer term housing responses. And I think that also needs to be highlighted as a really key piece that needs to be focused on. You know, we've identified trauma, we've identified, you know, that is refuge, transitional and FOIA, but we also know that young people need a much longer period of accommodation and support. And like Kate was saying with the social housing policy piece, it's a step up, step down model of support for a period of time. But we need to highlight that we need to look at what's the innovative responses we can do, and what can we develop for young people that's outside the current system that ensures that they have longer term stable accommodation for the time frame that they need. So yes, early intervention, but also that longer piece. I know we always come back to early intervention, and it's very important, but there's always going to be those young people that are in that rest of the system that need to have that longer term housing response that I just want to kind of highlight, because that's where we see one of the biggest gaps is we see young people cycling through because programs are finished, they've been moved on, things are finished up. So Yeah, I think that's a really key piece to just keep drawing out.
And I think there's a real tendency to conflate early intervention and prevention. And I think early intervention looks quite different from prevention. And I think there's big scope to, improve in the prevention kind of space. And I'm aware we're kind of running out of time, but one thing we do know about young people also is that they don't tend to seek formal assistance until they've really exhausted most of their informal supports.
Right.
And by that time, they're already in quite some strife. So it would be really great to have those prevention programs strengthened to help young people not needing those formalised supports.
Yeah. Well, we are reaching towards the end of our time, but I will just direct one last question at Wayne as we finish up, which is, I guess, to point out or to highlight the fact that we know that the Victorian Government is quite active in policy development at the moment in housing and homelessness areas. Also, the Victorian Government's working currently to bring a youth lens to a range of services and supports that are already provided to make sure that youth are seen in different types of service provision. And of course, the government's also reviewing the effectiveness of the homelessness system as a whole. So I guess my very direct question to you, Wayne, is, why do we also then need a youth homelessness strategy? Why is it important to have that as a standalone distinctive thing?
Yeah, I think we've spoke about this throughout here, but young people, developmental needs are different. They've experienced significant trauma, they need different response. That's time based on them and their needs. And the support overlay is really important for young people. And I believe the youth strategy can pull out that piece there so that we have a specific response and way of working with young people with the appropriate housing that is linked to it.
Okay.
Kate, do you have anything to add to that one?
Sorry, I was distracted by the dog needing to leave. And I think I sort of slightly missed the focus of the question.
Oh, that's okay, Kate. I just was saying, why do we specifically need a youth homelessness strategy, given that, there is all this attention going into, I guess, a youth strategy, a homelessness strategy? Why a youth homelessness strategy as a standalone thing? Why is that important?
I think just because young people's needs when they're homeless are quite different to adults, which we've touched on. So I think that's the sort of main reason, but also actually the drivers of homelessness for young people are different. Like that piece around family conflict is just really particular to young people. So I think that there's a lot more that we could do if we were sort of focusing both on those pathways into homelessness and young people's needs once they are homeless, that it really needs that strategy piece to knit those together.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Well, thank you to all of you, and also thank you to everyone who's been participating by putting forward their questions, and my sincere apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to or didn't perhaps address adequately. I apologise for that, but we did go through most of them, which is great. Look, just as I wrap up, and I just want to thank Wayne Merritt and Nicola Bracketts and Kate Colvin for their time and for joining us today and participating in this conversation. And I also want to take this moment, I guess, to point to another couple of AHURI events that are coming up. We've got our Hybrid Cities Conference, Uncharted Urban Futures, Australian Cities Post-Pandemic, which is a one-day conference that will examine Australia's population dynamics as a result of the COVID crisis, the delivery of critical social infrastructure, and also transport challenges that have emerged through the pandemic as well. So we invite you to join us on Thursday, the 18th of November for that conference. If you're in Melbourne, you can attend in person, but it'll also be run online and conducted as a hybrid national conference for this important national conversation. Registrations are open, and the link you can see there at the bottom. We'll also include that in the email we send out after this webinar. And also, I'm pleased to announce the National Housing Conference, which is coming up in March next year, the 2nd to the 4th of March at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. Again, this one's also in Melbourne, another national conference which we're having in Melbourne again this year. But it's also going to be available online, but by March, I'm hoping that lots of us can get together from around the country for that conference. Early bird registrations are open for that as well. A quick reminder, we'd appreciate your feedback on today's webinar in the survey that you'll be emailed shortly, and a reminder too that the recording of this webinar will be up on our website soon. You'll be able to revisit it, and you'll also be able to share it with colleagues should you wish. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you for our panelists, and until we see you again, goodbye.